Hey everyone, Tarekith here, and today I'm going to be looking at the Analog Rytm Mark II from Elektron. I never owned the first Mark I version. While I was curious when it was announced, what a new drum machine from Elektron would be like. The pads themselves on the Mark I units I felt were kind of hard to play, and some of the navigation issues were, it just felt kind of slow to navigate for me. It wasn't as quick as I thought it maybe could be every time I tried one. So when they announced the new Mark II versions, I was extremely interested. This is the first new form factor for Elektron in a long time. They've all had kind of the same rectangle box shape. And it also seemed to kind of address some of the issues I had. The pads are supposed to be improved, the layout's supposed to be easier to navigate, things like that. So I've been spending the last few weeks kind of getting up to speed on it and having fun programming some drum beats, and I thought I would kind of share my thoughts here for people who are curious about this box and haven't had a chance to try one themselves. I can say right off the bat, I think it's a gorgeous looking unit. The new case is really, really nice. It's really well made. The fit and finish on it's perfect. Everything feels really solid. I definitely like this larger layout compared to the previous Elektron boxes. Those were kind of iconic and nice and compact, but this new larger size really does make things a lot easier. Some of the other upgrades they've had on the new units, these pads are now kind of rubberized a little bit now. It's not super sticky like Electribe say, but they're definitely a little more playable than the earlier units. They're still pretty loud and clicky. It is like using a typewriter when you play an Elektron box in some ways. The new pads themselves, these new playing pads, much more responsive than the first version. They're still kind of hard for me, compared to say like a Machine or Ableton Push, but getting a full velocity range is pretty easy to do on this unit, which is good because there's no provision for adjusting the velocity sensitivity or anything like that. Like, it is what it is, and you just have to learn to get used to the sensitivity of the pads. The encoders are improved now too. I'll kind of show you that here in a second when we zoom in a little closer, but it's easier to kind of sweep across the whole range of values without multiple turns. So for live use, it's really nice and fluid, although there are some kind of caveats to that too. On the back, when we get to that, all there's separate outputs for all the instruments now, as well as 2 stereo audio inputs. One of the audio inputs is for directly sampling on the unit itself. There's a dedicated sampling page now where you can record samples right on the rhythm itself. The other pair of stereo inputs is just a pass-through, so if you have another groove box or something and you're playing live, you don't need a mixer. You can just plug that right into the back and the signal will go through untouched until the rhythm's outputs. I think it might go through the compressor, the master compressor, but don't quote me on that. So overall, I think it's a much nicer laid out unit now. There's a lot of things they've changed about the navigation on the unit that I think really speeds up the workflow. In some ways, I think the Rytm Mark II and probably the Analog 4 as well are kind of the best of the Elektrons. They've taken a lot of things they've learned over the years in the other boxes I've noticed and kind of streamlined some of the navigation and menu structure. It's not quite as complicated as the Octatrack is to set up for your own needs, even though there's still a lot of flexibility in how you can kind of use the rhythm and set it up. But I think instead of just talking about it, maybe I'll go through and show you some things. So let's take a minute here and kind of zoom in, and I'll go through some of the workflow tips, some things that have been improved, and then we can come back and kind of talk about kind of conclusions about this unit, what I think after using it for a few weeks now. So let's zoom in. Okay, here we are zoomed in on the front panel a little closer. There's also a stereo input for the new sampling functionality. With this button here, this sampling button, you can now sample directly on the unit itself. Basically, it's threshold recording. Once the signal passes your specified threshold, it'll start recording, or you can also manually trigger recording as well. Not a ton of functionality here. You can't sync the recordings to tempo or anything like that. Everything you record is converted to mono, 16-bit, and 48 kilohertz, if I remember correctly. And the longest sample you can have is 33 seconds. So not a lot of functionality compared to, say, the Octatrack, but if you don't want to use a computer to sample beats, you can do it right on the hardware right now, which is really nice. There's also 2 control inputs. You can use control pedals or CV inputs if you have a modular system to control certain parameters on the rhythm here. And of course, MIDI in, out, and through. The USB port for transferring sysx and samples, and then the power supply and power button. There's no way of locking the power cords. You can't remove it, unfortunately, but it is what it is. One thing I want to mention about the USB functionality is that we're kind of did a step back here compared to the Octatrack in that you can't just turn this device on and put it into disk mode, so you can access it directly from your computer. On the Octatrack, all of your projects and samples and everything are basically stored on an internal hard drive, just like the flash drive in this, but you could see that mounted as like an external drive on your laptop or your computer, which is really great for backing things up. With the Rytm, and I assume the Analog 4, if you want to back up your projects, sounds, patches, all that kind of stuff, it's all via sysax now with the Elektron C6 utility. And then you have to use the Elektron transfer utility to send samples to the unit. So it's not quite as easy as it was before for some reason. I'm not sure why they removed that functionality. It was very quick and simple to back up stuff and load new samples on the unit, whereas now we have to use dedicated software. So both of those are pretty quick though, so at least you're not waiting a really long time to load your samples and save your settings and things like that. Just thought I would point that out. As I mentioned, the new pads now are much easier to play. They're still pretty firm. They're not exactly super soft like on, say, the Machine or the Ableton Push. One thing I like about them is they actually light up to show you the decay time of whatever you're playing. If it's a drum synth or a sample, the pad will remain lit for as long as the sound is playing, which is kind of useful. One of the new layout things I like about here that they've done is that these are how you access all your different settings. So you can press function and play for your kit settings, function and mute for your sound settings, function and chromatic mode for your track settings, things like that, which is really handy way to access all your different setup parameters for the different parts of the machine. And then usefully, not only do you access those with function, but you can also reload those parts too by holding no and pressing these. So I can reload my kit, I can reload the sound, I can reload tracks, things like that, which is really handy. And also there's the same shortcut by pressing yes will let me save things. So I can save my kit, I can save a sound. So with these few buttons right here and just a couple different key combinations, it's really easy to navigate, and when you're writing songs, you can save your settings really quickly as you go. Just to kind of give you a brief overview of like how the Rytm is kind of organized, the kind of state of the machine is called a project. When you power it on, everything happens within a project. Inside a project are all the settings for the different sound machines, the synth engines, all your effects, your patterns, your tracks, any of your performance and scene settings, which I'll cover here in a couple minutes. That's all saved within one project. You can have 128 patterns in one project, 128 samples in one project, and 128 sounds in one project. A sound is basically just a collection of all the synth parameters for a specific drum voice, as well as any of the sample parameters. So if you've layered a kick drum sample over a kick drum synth, you can save that all as just one sound and recall that later on. And one of the nice things, there's shortcuts for that. You press function and turn the track level. You can see all your different saved sounds in here to organize in one list. So it's really quick to kind of load up sounds on pads if you want. One of the downsides though is you only get 128 sounds per project. One of the good sides about that is you also have sound locking. Those of you with the other Elektron boxes might be familiar with this, where within the sequencer step you can actually change sounds per step. So you could have different snare drums per step if you want. The same thing applies with samples. If you have multiple samples loaded, any sample in a project you can switch between on a per step basis. So even though you only have 12 tracks to work with, you can have multiple sounds per track, which is really handy. One of the downsides of this kind of layout workflow thing is that you can only have 8 drum sounds happening at once across these 12 pads. And they have to be specific to different drum sounds. What I mean by that is this lower row you can load bass drums and snare drums. So you can see there's bass drum hard, classic, FM, plastic, silky, sharp. And then we have snare drums, hard, classic, FM, natural, and that's it. So if you want a bass drum or snare drum, you have to load it on these bottom pads. Likewise, up here, we have, like, say, toms. You only have the option to load one tom machine across all of these 4 pads in the middle. And likewise, on the top, these are for cymbals and your cowbell sound. So in a way, it's kind of limiting. I don't mind the fact we can only use 8 sounds at once, but I wish we could kind of freely assign which machines were used on which pads instead of being forced to only use certain pads for certain sounds. On the plus side, the layout is kind of consistent with other finger drumming things you'll find for machines, so it's not wildly different than what you'll find like on an MPC or machine as far as like the layout of the different cymbal sounds and things like that. I should also note that some of these channels are kind of linked in a way that's similar to choke groups. For instance, on the rim shot and clap, you can only have one of these 2 sounds play at once, either the rim shot or the clap. You can't play both at the same time. It's just a limitation of the synth engines. And the rightmost of those two pairs will always have priority over the leftmost. So you can do it for like choking cymbals and things, but you can't turn that off. It's always going to be like that. You always have that choking going on. So let's see. So I mentioned we can have 128 samples per project, 128 sounds per project, 128 patterns per project. Those are spread across 8 banks. You get 8 banks of 16. Another thing that's kind of useful here on the Rytm is you can choose how you switch patterns. Normally, the pattern in the sequential mode, which is the default, you can see this LEDs kind of lit up above where it says sequential. The current pattern will play to the end, and then the next pattern will start playing. Let's see, it's 4 bars. It gets to the end of the 4 bars, the next pattern will play. Kind of boring pattern, sorry. So that's one mode. The other one is direct start. It'll start playing a second. If you put this direct start mode, the next pattern will start playing immediately when you select it. And when you select the next pattern always plays from the beginning. An alternate to that is instead of direct start, they have direct jump, which will immediately jump to the next pattern, but in the same position your previous pattern was in. So you don't lose any sync. If you're synced to another device or a DJ or something, you can switch patterns and not have it start over from scratch and throw the your phrasing off. And then this last option is temp jump. Basically, you can kind of queue up a pattern. So when the current pattern's done, the next pattern will play once, and then it'll go back to the first pattern automatically for you. That's kind of useful for live performance. You can chain patterns as well. Well, that's kind of an example right there of something I've noticed on this box is that sometimes I press certain button combinations and they don't immediately register. I pressed function, pressed sequential, but it didn't change from direct jump. I've also had problems with the shortcut for saving a project, which is function and project. It should take you to the saving screen. There's another shortcut where if you hold project, it takes you to the loading screen for a project. And sometimes for whatever reason, even though I press it really quick, it actually goes into the load project screen instead of the save project screen. It's actually caught me out a couple times. I've been working on a pattern and I'm really, really happy and I want to save my project while, everything's still playing. And they give you a warning message, this will overwrite your pattern when your project if you load a new one, but there's also those same warning messages for when you load a pattern, are you sure you want to load a pattern? And when you're in the heat of the moment, most people just hit yes really quick and fly through those, and I've lost some work I was working on because it loaded the pattern instead of loaded the project instead of saved the project. So I think there's some kind of software issues that Elektron still has to work out as far as that goes. Sometimes the UI just seems to be a little slow to what I'm doing. I'll press a button and it won't quite won't switch modes is the way I expected. The sound quality, the sound doesn't jump at all. Everything still works, but the UI just seems to kind of lag behind a little bit. Maybe that's just my unit, hopefully not, but I think there's another OS update coming soon when they release Overbridge, so maybe we'll see some bug fixes there. One of the really cool things about the Rytm is there's different ways to kind of modify your sound on the fly. The first of these is scenes, and basically scenes are kind of a way of instantly switching a bunch of parameters at once. You can lock different parameters from all the tracks onto one pad here, so when I press this pad, they all engage at once. So in this one, I turn the volume down for the bass drum and turn the filter down for a lot of the tracks. In this one, I shorten the decay and all the different drum sounds. And this is just instant on or off. So it's a really handy way to kind of make variations of your patterns without having to actually make separate patterns. You can just store all those things as scenes and quickly trigger scenes as you're playing. The other thing that's really handy is this performance mode, which is kind of the same concept, but in more of like a real-time controller aspect. Again, you can lock multiple parameters from all the different tracks onto one pad, and then it changes by how hard you press down on the pad. It's like a controller. So in this example, I'm kind of increasing the delay and reverb and also turning the pitch up on one of the samples the harder I press. This pad, it shortens the decay again based on how hard I press it. The decay gets shorter and shorter. One of the things they did on the new units, though, is you can access that same functionality anytime you want without having to be in performance mode just by turning this knob. Basically what you do is you hold down this quick performance button and select which performance pad you want to assign into the knob. And then whenever you turn the knob, so this is nice because if you're in, say, mute mode here, you can still tweak your patterns in real time and your performances with this knob, which is really handy. And you can mute it as well. You can quickly mute those changes. One of the tricks people have noticed about the Rytm, applies to the mkII version as well, is that if you're in performance mode and you have one or more pads pressed down and leave performance mode, those pads remain pressed. So it's actually a way to trigger more than one pad and kind of lock them in place. You can see it's kind of half-lit, showing me that I've still got some performance active. And you can combine performances and scenes. One of the things I like about the Rytm is the fact I mentioned before, you can so easily reload your kits. So if you've tweaked a bunch of parameters, you want to get it back to where you were, it's very quick to do that. The downside is there's no quick way to do that and kind of mute your performances and your scenes. So if you've got like a lot of scene action going on and you've got a scene turned on and you've got some performance stuff on, you've got to quickly kind of juggle buttons to kind of turn alls off at once. That's not so much a limitation, but I kind of wish there was a way to quickly kind of reset those. Let's see, what else do we have here? Chromatic mode. There's a chromatic mode for all the synth engines and samples too. Let me select a different track. And you get 4 octaves for that. It's pitched up too high, and that's pitched down way too low to hear. Unfortunately, I've got a bass drum sound kind of happening there, but this is actually really handy because you can play this in real time. You can play melodies for different synth engines. And it's really cool because there's now a trigger page here. So if you played a chromatic thing in, you can press the trigger where you have note data stored, and it'll show you actually what the note value is. So you can see, it's actually changing in the chromatic mode. So you can play it in real time, then you can go back and edit notes. Like if you made a melody and you want to change like one of the notes, got a bum note, you can change which pitch it's playing. And you can also select pitches directly from the pads this way. So that is really handy. The other thing that's nice about this trigger mode here is you can actually tell a step to trigger just the synth or just the sample engine per track. So you could have both playing at once, and then just on a fill you could have just the sample playing if you turn the synth engine off. We also have the very powerful trig conditions, this last parameter here. So if I hold down a step, I can change these conditions of the step, what will actually cause this step to sound. This first one is fill. There's a fill button, so this step will not play unless I hold the fill button down. So you could program a bunch of snare fills and things that only play when you hold this button down. Another option is, I guess, minus fill or negative fill. It'll play normally until you press the fill button down. This time when I press the fill button down, this step won't sound. And there's a whole lot of other options here too. Some conditional triggers. You can set like, this step will play if the step before it played, or this step will play if the step before it didn't play. There's also probability. This step will play 33% of the time. So there's a lot of really, really powerful things you can do here because you can lock other parameters to this step, like you can change the pitch, and then say, every time I press the fill button, the pitch of the drums will change when it hits that step. So from a performance aspect, I find that the Rytm is just great that way. There's so much you can do with just a 4-bar pattern. Honestly, with so many variations on scenes and things, I don't even use 4 bars most of the time. I'm still using 1 bar and just using conditional trigs to kind of add that variety as I go, especially with this dedicated fill button right here. As far as organizing things, you have a menu for your projects. You can load projects, save projects. There's a project manager. You can use this if you wanted to say, you can lock projects, you can copy projects, you can save samples to projects. What else do we have? We have the same functionality, project functionality with samples. When you send samples to the unit with the Elektron transfer unit, they're put in this incoming folder by default. And you can select certain ones, you can select all of them. You can move them into the current project, you can delete them, you can create a directory just for those samples. You can put little checks next to each sample by pressing yes to see which samples you apply as functionality to. So, there's a lot of flexibility here as far as how you organize your projects and samples, and you can do it all from the unit itself. Global slots, we have 4 slots for global parameters. If you have like a setup with setup for live performance is different from your setup for studio use, you can save different global slots for all the different settings. You can have the input for the sequencer be quantized automatically or not quantized. If it's not quantized, let's see, I'll show you an example. So a step, you can have micro timing. So you can slide a note off a strict 16th grid. And this is nice because you can play in real time, and if you don't want it quantized, you can come back later and correct some. If you have like a bum note, it'll show you this micro timing screen if you press left or right while holding that note down, and you can adjust where the note plays, which is handy. What else? We also have retriggering, so you can specify that a note will play not just for a 16th, but you could tell it to play for an 80th or a 20th. You can for triplets, things like that, 48th, 64th notes, stuff like that. You can say how long it'll retrigger for. In this case, it'll retrigger for a quarter note. And you can actually have the velocity increase over the time of that retriggering. Basically, it's a roll, or you can have it decrease over the time of that retriggering. There's actually a dedicated retrigger page here too, this little button over here for accessing the same functionality on a track-wide status, not just per step. So you can see there's a lot of flexibility here. There's a lot of different ways you can use a simple pattern and kind of morph it and let it evolve over time so that you don't have this static drum pattern all the time. And then you can factor in all the different scenes and performance modes, along with the ability to mute channels too. And there's really a lot of hands-on control this unit has. Another thing I kind of wanted to point out too is the new display on the units. They have these OLED displays now. I was a little hesitant to get the mkII units because when I saw the new Octatracks in person, the mkII Octatracks, the OLEDs weren't quite even. There was kind of darker and lighter parts of the display, and I saw a few different Octatracks that all had that. Luckily, at least on this Rytm, it's fine. It's a nice flat white like it should be. It looks really nice. It's sharp and crisp. One of the useful features is you press a knob now, or just turning a knob. This velocity one, it actually says the parameter name at the top, so you don't have to memorize these kind of abbreviations anymore. Some of these can kind of, be kind of confusing, and for some of the drum synths, SMP is sample trigger, and synth is synthesis trigger, and things like that. So that's really handy that you no longer have to memorize some of these arcane, abbreviations that they've used in the past. As far as the synth engine goes, it depends. These 8 parameters will change depending on which drum sound you have selected. This is the bass drum. You can do tuning. There's sweep time and sweep depth for kind of those pitch shift sounds. There's the decay time, hold time. This particular drum sound is like a dusty, they call it a dust level. Kind of dirties it up, and then you can change how much of the click you want. And of course, there's a level for just the synth part of the voice. Remember, you can layer a synth and a sample. The sample parameters, you get a tuning parameter, a fine tuning, bitrate reduction. This is really kind of the only insert effect other than distortion you have on each synth track. You can choose your sample here, which sample is actually going to play. This is actually cool because this is one of the synth parameters, part of the synth engine, the sample selection. You can actually automate this, so you can change samples like with the LFO to have it automatically select a new sample just when the LFO is sweeping, which is kind of cool. You get start point, end point, and if you reverse those, they can get. If you make the end point shorter than the start point, it'll play things in reverse. You can also turn on looping for the sample, looping on and off. You can't specify a loop time. It basically just loops the entire sample. That's actually one of the kind of downsides of the fact that you can kind of resample the input, the output of this unit to make like a loop. You can use loops in the unit, but there's no way to specify a specific loop time or loop point. You can't like make tempo sync loops right on the unit itself, unfortunately. And then again, we have level control for just the sample engine. The filter is kind of the standard Elektron filter. It's maybe I should say it's kind of the standard Elektron analog filter. You have different types. Here's your frequency, resonance, low pass 2, band pass, high pass 2, band sweep, band reject, peaking. This is another kind of thing I wanted to point out about these knobs that on the new units that's kind of annoying. When you turn them fast, if you're just playing, tweaking and doing a performance, it's actually really responsive. You can get the full range of parameters just with a quick turn, and it's pretty intuitive. But when you're trying to dial in a specific value, like for this filter type, it can be really hard to kind of narrow in on just exactly what you want. It's a little jumpy at times. It's almost too sensitive. It'll go through like all the parameters really quick. I'm hoping that's just a software issue, and Elektron can kind of make that slow down a little bit. So in addition to the standard filter frequency and resonance type, you can also specify the envelope amount with the filter envelope as well. Attack, decay, sustain, release, pretty standard stuff. You get the same envelope for your amplitude, basically a volume envelope. You also have a delay and reverb send per track, as well as panning, and again, volume for the track as a whole. And then we have the LFO. LFO speed, they have multipliers, so if you want to 8 times the base speed, you can do that. You select the destinations here, turning this knob. Sometimes you can also use the button up and down just to go scroll through the list. I find that they're kind of inconsistent on what they let you use. Some lists you can use the knob, some lists you can use the up and down buttons. Some lists you can hold function and go up and down to kind of scroll faster through those lists, and some lists it doesn't actually work with the functionality of using function for faster. I don't know why. LFOs can be run free. They can trigger on each note. They can hold once a note is triggered, and then they can run once, or they can run just half cycle, so you almost get like a third envelope out of that. I mentioned effects. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing on the amplifier page. There's also an overdrive built in, an analog overdrive per track. I actually like the way this sounds. It's really nice. It's a good way to add just a little bit of oomph to a sound, like without getting distorted. I mean, it'll go into distortion, but just between like 0 and 10, it adds just a little bit of warmth and some extra volume, which I find really useful. So that's it as far as like the synth engine goes, synth and sample engine goes. The only really effects you have are the overdrive and then the bitrate reduction for the samples themselves. The only other effects are global, and you access those by pressing the effects button. So here we have a delay. You can set the time. It can be synced to tempo or not. It can be cross-channel feedback. This is actually one of the only ways to get any kind of stereo information happening with the drum machine. I mean, you can pan sounds, but with everything, the synth engine itself and the samples are mono. So if you want to add a little more stereo width to the sounds, you can set this cross parameter on and then choose how wide those delays go. You have a feedback as well, and then you can high pass filter and low pass filter the delay repeats, so they get kind of softer and softer as they go on. You can also choose how much of the delay effects engine will be sent to the reverb engine directly, which is kind of useful for some really kind of trippy dub stuff. The delay sound itself, I mean, it's okay. It's nothing fancy, to be honest. I think it's pretty basic, but it works really good. We also have a reverb, a global reverb. There's not multiple different reverb types like on, say, the Octatrack. I'm a big fan of the dark reverb from the Octatrack, and I find that in general the reverb and the rhythm is a bit brighter sounding. Maybe cleaner would be a phrase I could use. I kind of wish we had a little more options as far as how the reverb sounded. You have a pre-delay, you have the decay time. There's a shelving filter, so you can specify like a shelving point and then boost the gain or lower the gain to make it brighter or darker. So if you want the real high of the reverb really bright, you can do that. Or if you want it really muted sounding, you can do that. And there's also like a high pass filter and low pass filter, again, just for the reverb itself. So there's some flexibility for how you can shape the reverb, but it's not quite as in-depth as I would like. The third effect is global distortion, and it gets pretty dirty. And quite a bit louder. You can change the symmetry for the distortion, how it basically it's like a distortion character. And the symmetry will actually change the output of the machine even when the distortion is turned down all the way, which is kind of interesting. And you can also overdrive just the delay channel as well. The distortion's good. It sounds good. It's analog distortion. You know, it's decent. It's kind of strange that that's like a global thing. You can only globally distort some of your sounds. I kind of wish that was like a send effect as well. I'd probably use it more often, but it is what it is. There's also an analog compressor on board, threshold, attack, release. There's a couple different automatic release settings, A1, A2, and then you can specify it in milliseconds if you prefer. Makeup gain for the compressor, you can set your ratio. Sidechain EQ, you can set it to off if you want the whole signal compressed. If you want kind of more of that pumping sound, you can bypass the low pass. You can engage a low pass filter so that the compressor is reacting only to the bass. You can engage a high pass filter to kind of reduce that some. Or you can just do hit, which is like full on just normal compression. And there is a mix knob for the compressor as well, a dry wet mix knob, so you can kind of do New York style compressor. You can blend in a really heavily compressed version of your signal with the dynamics of it without, which is nice. And then, excuse me, there's also a volume level for kind of an overall output volume after the compressor as well. And then finally, there's an LFO as well for the effects. So you have an LFO per track for the synth engines, and then you also have an LFO for the effects engines. So you can kind of do some crazy things like change delay time randomly by using sample and hold random waveforms, things like that. So yeah, I think the synth engine itself on this unit, I think it's pretty well done. It's intuitive. It's easy to get dialing the sounds you want. I'm sort of disappointed there's not more options for some of the sounds. Like I said, like for the toms, like you really only have one option for the tom, this BT Classic for the low tom, or this, oops, sorry. That's kind of an example of like the button presses, the UI not keeping up with what I'm doing there again. It was kind of a step behind what I was doing. But again, for the toms, you only have this XT Classic, same with this one, XT Classic, you know, so you only have one synth choice for each one of these 4 pads. I kind of wish there were some more options there. And same with the hi-hats. You have like a classic hi-hat, kind of like a Roland style hi-hat sound, or this metallic hi-hat. The open hi-hats, same way, classic or metallic. And then this kind of random basic noise, white noise source you can use as well. So it's kind of disappointing there's not more options as far as like the synth engines go, but luckily we can layer samples, and that kind of takes some of the pain away from that to kind of get more variety in what you can do with it. So that's a quick overview of the unit itself and some of the functionality. I didn't cover how to go through all the different sequencing steps. There's so many different ways to use this, and I think the manual is actually pretty well written. So if you're considering this unit and you want to kind of get a little more knowledge about how the sequencer works and things like that, and the different kind of trigs you can do, and the fact you can mute trigs, and you know, there's an accent track, and you can do swing and parameter slides. These are all kind of familiar for anybody who's on an Elektron box. They're all here too. A new thing is that the trig mutes, you actually have a separate screen. You can mute certain trigs and just bring those back in when you want. So another performance feature that you don't find on any other Elektron boxes. But yeah, if you're interested in the sequencer and kind of more in-depth knowledge, the manual is pretty well written and it's pretty short. Half of it's just appendices in the back. So definitely take a look at that. It's available for free on the Elektron website. So yeah, that's the functionality, kind of a quick overview, run through of what it can do and how it's laid out. Let's kind of step back and I'll share my thoughts on this unit overall and let you know what I think. Okay, so that was a closer look at some of the functionality of the new Rytm mkII. Overall, I think it's probably the most performance-oriented of all the Elektron boxes to date. There's so many provisions there for tweaking your sounds, your patterns, and everything in real time. The fact that you can reload your kits and now you can reload patterns and track sounds and things like that with just a quick button press is super handy. The knobs themselves are nice. I like the fact that they have kind of like acceleration built in. It's much easier to tweak settings when you're playing live and cover the full range of a parameter without having to sit there and twist it a bunch, or press down and just have a hard twist that doesn't really have much finesse to it. The downside of that, as I mentioned, is that it's really hard to kind of narrow in on certain specific parameters. I'm hoping that this is like a software fix Elektron can do to adjust that. The other thing as far as software goes, like I did mention that sometimes the UI seems to lag a little bit behind what I'm trying to do, especially if I'm changing up these different pad modes. There's times that like I'll press the button and they don't quite switch right, or the lights kind of freak out a little bit and doesn't quite show me what it's supposed to right away. I thought this was kind of user error at first, but it just seems to happen kind of randomly, that like it just gets overloaded perhaps for a second with information and takes a second to catch up. And then the other problem I talked about was the shortcut for saving projects, the function plus project button. I have problems with that, sometimes getting confused with load project, and I've lost some work that way. So I think there's probably a little bit of tidying up Elektron can do in the OS, and hopefully we'll see an update to that soon. They've already said a new OS is coming just to enable the overbridge functionality. Speaking of overbridge, it's a little disappointing that that still isn't out. I don't really need the plugin GUI thing for my DAW, but I did want to use this as a sound card a couple times since that's advertised functionality, and it looks like you need overbridge to do that, which is a little disappointing. But as a performance box, I think it's really hands-on, it's well made, it's solid, it's definitely going to stand up to get to gigging frequently. Some of the things I kind of hesitate about, just the lack of variety in some of the machines. One of the things I didn't quite expect so much, I guess, on the Rytm is that it's so similar to the machine drum that in a lot of ways it just feels like the successor to the machine drum instead of like a completely separate unit. I mean, there's still some things the machine drum can do that the Rytm can't, with control all knobs or control 8, being able to do recorder locks and things like that. But the actual sound of the Rytm itself kind of reminds me a lot of the machine drum, and I'm not saying they're identical. They definitely have some differences, but just the parameters you're given for the machines, and the fact that so many of the machines on the Rytm are very similar to the machine drum machines, it definitely has that kind of Elektron synthesis, drum synthesis sound to it that I wasn't quite expecting. I was thinking maybe, you know, with the hype on the analog thing, I kind of bought into more than I should have. I was expecting something a little warmer. Instead, I would say that overall the sound is tight more than warm. It's not saying it sounds bad by any means, but the sound quality definitely of the drum synths was not quite what I expected. It's much similar to the machine drum than I thought it would be. But we have the option to offset that with samples, so at least now you can kind of layer those kind of deeper tones from the synth engines with, you know, more percussive transient samples to kind of mesh those two together and create brand new drum sounds. So in that respect, I think it's, you know, it's still really, really flexible. So overall, I like the Rytm quite a bit actually for a drum machine. There's a lot of flexibility going on there. There's a lot of options you can do to make your patterns evolve over time. In some ways, it's almost as complex as the Octatrack. There's a lot of setup things you can do to control how your sequences will be triggered or quantized, things like that. But it's still not quite as convoluted as the Octatrack can be. That all the settings seem to be kind of where you might expect them to be, versus on the Octatrack you have to kind of hunt around, you know, to find your recorder setups and your mixer setups and things like that. So I like it. It's definitely more complex than I thought it would be. I can see this would take me quite a bit of time to kind of figure out exactly how I want to use this. When I originally got it, it was going to be just a drum machine to use with my OB6. But now I got it, I can see that it could function as kind of a standalone groove box as well, provided, you know, you're willing to live with some of the limitations. The lack of effects variety for one, the fact that your samples had to be mono, which is always kind of disappointing. But I'm kind of now leaning more towards seeing what I can do just to create live sets using just this box by itself, which is good because there's a lot going on when you're actually playing it live in a setting, like when you're performing with it. There's a lot of things to keep track of, and I think that's true of a lot of Elektron boxes. That, you know, once you start pairing these with other pieces of gear, like the amount of things you have to manage mentally becomes quite exponential. So there's a lot of flexibility here, a lot of depth. I think that I'm gonna have some really good music coming out of this thing in the near future. It's not perfect, it's not quite as warm sounding as I thought it might be, and I didn't think there'd be so much reliance on distortion as like one of the main effects. But overall, I really like it. I think they did a good job. Anyone using machine drum, I think you'll be very familiar quite quickly with the Rytm, even though things are laid out differently. Navigating and kind of tweaking your sounds is very similar, and you can kind of expect the same results once you dive in and see the same parameters you're used to. So yeah, it's a good box. I can't wait to use it some more here in the future, and I would say stay tuned maybe another week or two after I've had some more time with it and get some questions from people. I'll do like a second follow-up to this review where I can kind of answer any concerns people have or touch on any areas I think I might have forgotten on in the first review. So thanks for watching. As always, put comments down below, and I will see you all next time.